Several years ago, I watched a very interesting dialogue between the preeminent advocate for intelligent design, Stephen Meyer, and the philosopher-mathematician David Berlinski, and indeed the biologist-mathematician Eric Weinstein. And at one point in the conversation, David Berlinski was reminiscing about his visit to the Natural History Museum in London, whereupon visiting the paleontology section, he noted that between the simple organisms and slightly more complex organisms were these arrows. And he got to wondering, as he watched these chains of arrows, up the course of the so-called evolution, whether the arrows themselves were discovered amongst the rubble of the fossilized remnants themselves. Yeah, it is rather comic. This is Benjamin Martin, and this is Ragtime. It is like the Far Side Cut. I have with me, and I feel deeply honoured and privileged to have such distinguished guests. Firstly, Peter de Jager, who we had a lovely dialogue with just a few days ago on the subject of serialism. Peter de Jager is a brilliant musician, wonderful pianist and composer. Indeed, I've played some of his works, and he's played some of my works at one point. And he's also, I would describe him as a man of wide-ranging interests and very developed to the point of being a kind of polymath, but he may reject that description. Despite his young years, Peter de Jager has worked with some illustrious personalities in music, not least the indomitable Pierre Boulez, visiting Lucerne on several occasions. With him is the world-renowned scholar and musician Peter Tregear. Again, he has a list of accomplishments way too numerous to mention, but I'll give this a go. He is as I say, musician, composer, arranger, conductor, and also a writer as well, an author who specializes, or his expertise is in particular with the Weimar period. And he's written a book on Ernst Krenek. He has held some extremely illustrious positions, including, for example, at the Fitzwilliam and Churchill Colleges in Cambridge, where he had a lectureship. And indeed, in 2020, he was awarded the Order of Australia Medal for his services to education in music and professional, what was it? Professional...
Associations, I think.
Professional societies or something, yes, that's right. So a great pleasure to have you both here. Now, I mentioned in the introduction this bit about David Berlinski's comic quip about wondering what these arrows were doing in between the fossilized remnants in accordance with Darwinian selection. And perhaps my guests and the listeners can pick up why I'm mentioning this, because when it comes to anything involving evolution, there's almost invariably this notion of causation, as in a connection between one event and the other, or a succession of events. If there's no intrinsic connection between the events, then how can we be talking about an evolution? So while I leave that thought suspended for a while, or for a moment, let's listen to the beginning of Liszt's Faust Symphony. That was the beginning to Liszt's Faust Symphony. Now, I remember as a young student being told many times how these 12 tones that Liszt utilized in this piece presaged Schoenberg's serialism. And indeed, we could go back and find other instances where composers utilize all 12 tones in wonderful ways, such as in Beethoven's Grosse Fuge in the introduction, or indeed in Bach's final fugue from the Well-Tempered Clavier, Book 1. And actually, either of my guests might be able to think of some earlier examples. Are there any earlier examples of this adopted?
Well, I thought it was
outside of chromatic scales. Yes.
Mozart's 40th Symphony as well,
yes,
in the fourth movement.
Right.
Which is not earlier than Bach, of course, but yes.
Well, so this got me wondering as to this business of causation, because, as I say, in order to be even talking about a musical canon or evolution, there needs to be a sense of some connection between the events. And my question really is to what extent this might be superimposed, or to put it this way, can we really be thinking about an evolving principle in itself with regard to this compunction for composers to an increasing degree to feel like they need to be utilising all 12 pitches in some kind of sequence? Peter Tregear, any thoughts on that?
Look, I've got a classic academic answer and say yes and no. I mean, yes, because it's one of those things that if you take serialism in particular, or perhaps more accurately, the 12-tone technique, and Schoenberg's development of it, he himself saw it very much in this way. So we have it as a historical fact that, crudely speaking, ideas of musical progression, the idea that of a development, an expansion of tonal, and I mean that in the broader sense, not the technical sense of Western period tonality, but tonal horizons, was precisely that, an expansion. I think it behoves us, though, to question whether that, as well as being a historical fact, is also we might sort of a prima facie fact, or something that sits outside history, is something that actually talks in the way that an evolutionary biologist, say, is a kind of fundamental principle that sits outside human endeavour. That, I think, gets more complicated for all sorts of reasons, one not least political. We live in a world now where Western culture in particular, and I'm saying this quite neutrally, this is not to imply my own position on this, but I think, again, as an observer on how we think about history, is very uncomfortable with ideas of progression. It's certainly in academia, in substantial part by, and I'm going to use a very loose word, but the sort of so-called decolonisation movement. This idea that in the notion of progression is a sense of the West as best, as an idea that this is something that the West does better than anyone else. And it goes back to, I mean, very quickly, and I'll finish here on this point. It goes back to that, even in an Australian sense, and the ideas even of terra nullius, the idea that what gave us the right to this country was that we had property and property laws, and we built buildings, and so on and so forth. So that gave us an inherent moral right, because in a way we were on the right side of history, because we were progressing. Whereas a culture, a pre-modern culture, when we talk about 60,000 years of Aboriginal history, it seems to be essentially the same. And now we're in a culture, at a time and place where, of course, we're increasingly valuing the fact that there is a sustainability about pre-78 cultures. And so there's a questioning, a profound questioning of the notion of progress. I say all that, and again,
sure. I
think it's, again, none of this sits comfortably, because I personally think progress is a thing. I mean, I think we sit in a world with, electronics and high-class medical drugs and so on and so forth, and scientific progress in particular seems to be, in one sense, an undeniable fact that we should be able to reflect on outside the complicated, messed up moral frame of history. And I think, so to go back to your question about music, I think the question for us as musicians is there something about musical development that also, as I say, sits outside history, or are we talking about something that's really a peculiarly European notion that every generation needs to do things better than the previous one?
Right, exactly. I mean, exactly. How much are we superimposing something which doesn't actually exist? I mean, for one, there seems to be this hardwired compulsion, as I say, with increasing orders of complexity, it's very easy for us to think that's advancement. But as any neo-Darwinist worth their salt will tell you, not necessarily, because the attributes guaranteeing survival need not be increasingly complicated, for one. Peter de Jager, do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, we've opened so many different boxes here.
That's what this is about.
Pandora's boxes, I think.
Yes, I mean, the thing about an idea of... I suppose I should start by saying that the idea of progress probably shouldn't be thought of as a line, because one could think of it maybe as a line with branching points in different directions, maybe each leading to more complexity and sophistication, but not necessarily complexity and sophistication of the same sort. And I think that's what, especially in a musical context... Well, in a musical context, I wonder whether we're talking about complexity at all, because in some ways you could say that Schoenberg's system, for example, led to less complexity in some areas and more complexity in others. And when we talk about complexity, we're also biased in the West, I think, to think of that in terms of pitch complexity above all else. And of course, what was the great story of American popular music but the introduction of greater rhythmic complexity from various sort of half-forgotten African traditions, for example?
Absolutely. Well, another thing, I suppose, is a really simpleton observation to make here, but how are we to know anyway what these composers had in mind? I mean, how much and this is a problem, right? Was Liszt consciously thinking, I must use all these 12 tones, or was he aware of it as an afterthought? Bach, the same, Beethoven. Any thoughts on that, Peter Tregear?
Yeah, and I immediately say to listeners of this podcast that I don't come to this as an expert on Liszt or the Faust Symphony. However, I know and have read enough around that particular period of mid-19th century Western European history to know that people like Liszt, and of course Strauss had followed him, and Wagner and so on, were incredibly well read. They were people that saw what they were doing as not just involved in a musical tradition, but also in a wider cultural one, including that music was engaging quite directly with questions of society and philosophy. So, to the extent to which we can then make what might sound to people who think music is just music, grandiose observations, again, like I was saying at the beginning, we have at least, if not the right to do so, it's acceptable to do so simply because of the historical fact they were doing, right? Yes. That's what they were doing. So I think one of the clues to your to answer that question would surely be in the title, the Faust Symphony, and that if you think about the Faust myth, about the triumph or the brief triumph of scientific reason over, if you like, what as Goethe calls it, our divided soul between the rational soul and the emotive, emotional one. If you were looking for a kind of musical symbolism, and Liszt was, of course, thinking about musical symbolism and how tones could construct or allude to non-musical things. If you like, the idea of a constructed, hyper-rational musical moment would be 12 tones. To actually create this music that actually foregrounds the fact that it's artificiality. It's artificiality, again, that's a loaded word, but if you like, it's hyper-rationality. And the curious way to think about it, this sort of leads towards Schoenberg, is of course that in that, of course, it's its own critique. And again, go back to the Faust myth. I mean, Faust becomes a divided soul, somebody who's alienated from himself, so that you're already not so much getting just a sort of a hint of Schoenberg, you're also getting a hint of Adorno and the people that sort of look at 12-tone serial music and 12-tone music is actually containing within its very structure a kind of critique of modern social conditions and the modern divided self. Wow. Again, does that sound all rich? It does sound rich, but the historical record is that that's how they're talking about it. So, what the wonderful thing about that, I think, is yes, but how interesting that is, because, I mean, just put the word Faust in and suddenly you've got this enormous wealth of
archetypal, right?
Yes,
archetypal.
Exactly right. Of ideas about the self that are developing at this time. So that I think also remind us, and this is something I'm already keen when I do a little bit of teaching of serial music and 12-tone music, that for all its constructedness, for all the fact that you can go delve down and look at it as a sort of mathematical approach to ordering music, there's no question, including with Schoenberg and absolutely with Weber and in Berg, they're also seeing it as a fundamentally humanistic thing to do, that they are in conversation with the great questions of their time, and not just musical questions.
Peter de Jager. Any thoughts?
Well, I mean,
too many thoughts. Too many thoughts.
and this is such a complete sort of historical, cultural a reading of the subject that I feel in many ways there's not a lot more to say, because one can, as you say, talk about these things in a mathematical, in a theoretical sense, but really the nub of them is something more human, more cultural. But I suppose it occurs to me to mention that also, as soon as you have the closing of the circle of fifths, if our listeners are presumably aware of that concept, which happened, let's say around 1700. As soon as you have the closing of the circle of fifths, you have equally or unequally spaced a vocabulary of 12 notes. Yes. In practice. Although I would say until the middle of the 19th century, you have a split between keyboard instruments, which have 12 notes, and other instruments, which I think did still distinguish for quite a long time between notes such as B flat and A sharp, for example. So in that sense, as soon as you have a fixed set of 12 pitches, the ideas of partitioning them in certain symmetrical ways, for example, like the opening of Liszt's Faust Symphony, you have these augmented triads moving in semitones.
It's his favourite, right?
And so because you have, and it's sort of almost an accident that because you have the number 12, you have 12 is a composite number, and so 3 times 4 means you can spread that, without repeating any tone over the whole chromatic scale. And of course, as Peter points out, this has great symbolic capacity as well.
Well, yes, and to add confusion to the mix, of course, there was Wagner's own idea of futurism, wasn't there, with making everything bigger and better, basically, as opposed to Schumann, and getting Brahms on board, perhaps for, all kinds of reasons, but with the FAE composition. Moving along now, thanks so much, gentlemen. Where are we? It would have sounded strange in its time, thus spake Huxley in The Devils of Loudun. Moro Lasso al mio Duolo is a most extraordinary work, and as I understand it, Gesualdo composed pretty free of constraints, is that correct? So whatever constraints there may have been with regard to avoiding certain intervals, and we may go into that a bit later, he seemed to be able to work aloof from such constraints. But I guess my question is, with regard to this notion under the heading, it would have sounded strange in its time. Oh, I made a mistake earlier. Huxley didn't say that. He said something else. Sorry. No. But so often, I'll fix that later.
Footnote, errata.
There's a footnote. I got them mixed up. It would have sounded strange in its time is something that I constantly heard throughout my student years and later. I don't know if you've heard this when it comes to any number of compositions, and it always bothers me a little bit.
Yes.
For one fundamental reason it bothers me is that maybe are we losing receptivity to old dissonances or those, dissonances past by saying, we're okay with anything now? Because if we're going to talk about any sense of progress, if we can bring back that word for a moment, how can we reconcile that with a sort of dulled receptivity, say, to these false relations in Gesualdo and so forth, which is so otherwise intriguing? Are we sort of flatlining, if you know what I mean? Any thoughts on that, Peter de Jager?
And do you think we are less receptive to Gesualdo's dissonances now than they were then?
Well,
or less?
I think by virtue of saying it would have sounded strange in its time, yes. I think when someone says that, it's basically by definition almost, yes.
I mean, in the case of Gesualdo, there was certainly a coterie of people who were creating music like that. Perhaps he represents the most extreme and, because of his nobility and leisure time, I suppose, the most unfettered example. And in many ways, I feel like the prevailing cultural attitude of that circle in Italian society was to be bizarre. And so that implies a reaction against a sort of more normalized culture, one which was less like that, or more rule-bound, perhaps.
Yeah, I'm not thinking there's an analogy. I've never really thought of it before, but your analogy to sort of the closing of the circle of fifths is creating this attempt to free fall through pitch space. I think Gesualdo's also picking up that once you are less concerned with the theoretical abstraction of Greek modes, you're in a similar space. And so he's suddenly this music. Once the promise of the tri can go in, or in constant intervals can go in any direction suddenly, and he does. It's a sort of a free fall through a sort of a kind of tonal space. So there's a direct analogy there. I'm a little bit. I think probably if I'm right, Peter, where you're heading to, I'm a little bit the same. Is that the moment? There's been times when I would say, yeah, we are losing. And I'm talking we here, I mean musicians, before I thought the wider public, but we're losing a receptivity to earlier forms of dissonance. And then I go and do some early music and I'm just blown away by a simple triad. And I'm taking a particular example of this is a wonderful chorus, the final chorus of Carissimi's Jefter, which at one point it suddenly appears in this otherwise prima pratica sort of Palestrina-like texture. He puts in a single note which creates basically a dominant seventh and third inversion, and it absolutely tears you apart. And I'm thinking, it's just a dominant seventh chord, folks. Yes. Why would I? But do you know what I mean? It's like in that once you sort of again, and I think this comes down to so much receptivity. It comes to sensibility. If you're aware of the sensibility of these periods, and I think it is able to understand them for what they are. Similarly, things like Rameau, who is, if you like, in the sandpit of early common practice tonality, it's pretty quickly, when you start listening to that music and it's played really well, you get the sense of what is shocking and not, even though that, in fact, in the context of the 21st century, there's nothing shocking at all in the musical material there. So I think that comes another bit to sensibility. I think we have a more fundamental problem that I think, as the we now, I'm thinking more beyond musicians, is that we've become desensitized in the way that we've become desensitized to language or to, if you constantly never take care when you cook, you become desensitized to flavors and tastes. This is a problem more of modern life, that it takes a moment where you need to sit back and listen carefully. And if you're not listening carefully, everything just becomes the kind of just nice or not nice sounds. Maybe I'm over romanticizing the capacity of active listening, but then again I'm also realise that there is Adorno and others who've been talking about this for 100 years ago. But I do think that it's something actually rather more fundamental, that we're losing that ability to listen actively. At that point then, I still find I'm desperately moved by, or shocked, I should say, by Gesualdo, as I am by The Rite of Spring or something, that still sounds shocking to me. It still does.
Right. Well, on that, I'm sure Ross Duffin, for one, would be in agreement with you, having written his well-known book, How Equal Temperament Ruined Harmony, and in terms of our losing receptivity, as far as he was concerned, to the most vital element, as far as he was concerned, with Western harmony and probably the canon. Any thoughts on that, Peter de Jager? Or this whole subject in general. You can pick it from anywhere you like.
Well, again, so much. I mean, I think two things. First, I want to pull up the idea of perhaps a pedagogical or a contemporary musicological theoretical culture which views, again talking about evolution, which views our modern system of composition basically inherited from Schoenberg, with its ideas of the 12 tones and of a certain complexity, pitch complexity, and approach to dissonance, viewing that as an advanced stage to which we must read earlier music as trying to aspire to, which I think is fundamentally wrong. And second, it seems to me that history operates in these cycles of normativity, if you like. That there's a period of highly rule-bound culture, which might seem a bit banal, and then on the other extreme, there's this culture of, we could call it, I like to call it in a historical revisionist kind of sense, a modernist culture, in fact, because I think that's what we had in the 20th century. I think that's what we had in 16th century, 17th century Italy, and also in 14th century France or thereabouts. This culture where people are genuinely looking for further sophistication and also to shock in contrast to the more widespread culture. And in the middle of these two is that beautiful area where I think we look back and see that the art that has echoed through the centuries that we consider the greatest lives, where it finds that balance point between familiarity and, like you said with Jephthah, it's the placement of that note against the expectation of what has been and what is to come that creates the effect.
Any thoughts, Peter Tregear?
I'm actually, I think that's a rather lovely description. I think if I was apt to put to stake a position rather than just, as academics do, a series of observations and implied positions, I would pretty much be in furious agreement with Peter. I think that's right. I think that appears to be, well, I guess it also reflects a certain, I mean, it's Faustian again, isn't it? This sort of restlessness that seems to be ingrained in the human condition, which we constantly sort of push barriers on either side. That, I mean, it maybe this goes back to your opening gamut about evolution. Maybe there's something inbuilt in the way, for various evolutionary survival reasons, that when society and its culture is comfortable, there's always going to be, like a kind of bell curve of personality types and so on, and creative types, people that are going to push the boundaries, and no doubt, the evolutionary biologists can think of reasons for why that would be in a survival sense, and in culture, I think the same thing happens, and those boundary pushes, of course, are also contingent on the time and place at which they are. So again, we don't need to essentialise the idea that there is one grand narrative of progress. What we see is these kind of pushes and pulls through history. And look, I think, going back to perhaps where my pedagogical hat, this is the one thing that that strikes me that makes Western art music traditions awkward for those who simply want to equalise everything and say that, for instance, that we should be teaching all cultures of all times without any sense of value. The one thing that Western art music tradition has, and that I think is a kind of, I'm going to use language that people listening here
go for it, it's okay.
As a kind of objective fact, is
okay.
It has a profound historical record. And the reason why it has that is not because West is best or Western people do things better, it's because we wrote things down in a certain way. Mm-hmm. And this gets back to your thing about canon formation you mentioned earlier. That means that not only can we have art that dialogues with itself in its time, it also dialogues with its own past. And that's, of course... That's
very T.S. Eliot. That
well, it is.
Very,
but it's,
yeah.
and hence,
that's very good.
And it brings us back to Schoenberg. Schoenberg is, I mean, to use the Harold Bloom thing, the anxiety of influence. I mean, my God, did he or did he not know, thinking that he's composing into a tradition? So he's not only sort of pushing against the boundaries of his time, he's also pushing part of his place, I should say, but also of time. And that just means that stuff can happen with a certain kind of richness that is simply not possible if you don't have whatever that form of literacy is, some form of literary tradition. It's simply just, I think, if you like, there's an inbuilt limit to what oral traditions and so on can do in that sense, even though they can be incredibly sophisticated in their own right and so on. So again, this is not a question of absolute value. I think it's just an observation, nevertheless, of a particular process that can only happen if you have the tools of literacy, if you like, of memory, of that extends beyond their biology into pieces of paper or books and so on and so forth.
This is Ragtime. At any given time and place, I'll give this another go. Certain thoughts remain unthinkable. That is indeed by Aldous Huxley in The Devils of Loudun. I think it's an extraordinary observation by a very, very deep thinker. And let's listen to this. That was perhaps the most famous passage from Stravinsky, Les Sacre du Printemps, or The Rite of Spring. And I'm just going to throw this wild question out there. How might those repeated chords have sounded to Mozart? Who wants to go first?
Well, I was thinking about this just before, actually, and perhaps as an opening gambit, I can put forward the idea that quite possibly, in a harmonic sense, he would not have been able to accept that that collection of pictures or that superimposition of harmonic material could have been used for positive aesthetic purposes.
That sounds a reasonable response. What do you think, Peter Tregear?
He would have been shocked, no question about it. But one of the reasons why he'd have been shocked is that the actual form of it reflects a kind of sensory, let alone a sensory experience that I think, by and large, is so alien to early 19th century, or late 18th century, late 18th century, obviously, Vienna, whereas it doesn't 1913 Paris, and that is simply because the rise of the machine and technology and the fact that the repeated rhythms of a kind of mechanised form is something that, even though it's deeply shocking then, there is a kind of reference point. And the other thing, of course, is this this wallowing in a sound in itself. Now, of course, we hear it, and it is a very aggressive thing, but essentially what Stravinsky is doing is taking a chord and saying it is a Ding an sich. It's a thing in itself. It's not going backwards or forwards. It's simply a moment that you dwell in. And I'm trying to think, like that question you were asking earlier about earlier examples of this. I mean, obviously the opening of Rheingold would be one. I mean, I'm just thinking of Wagner's Rheingold and then
the enormous E flat.
Because the E flat is played for so long that eventually you
that's
almost
right.
don't
You're
care.
swimming. No, that's right.
You're not really thinking about beginning or end.
Yes.
Although it does have a developmental process and it's an additive one, simply more instruments coming on. But in harmonic terms, it sits in and of itself. I mean, of course, the wonderful metaphor for for the creation of the world and so on and so forth in that opera. But that, I think, would have been a shocking development. That being said, we all know that there are some pretty interesting, inverted commas, dissonance and use of dissonance per se in Mozart, but they are always, just resolved, they're always, as it were, directional.
They're always justifiable within an 18th century harmonic context.
So it just would have exceeded the vocabulary, to put it simply, in that of its time. But What about just the notion of some kind of... Do you think he might have thought it was still, as a caveman sound, for want of a better description,
Well,
kind of an interesting chord? I mean, he was, of course, one of the great musicians of all time, and just as a chord, you know, that maybe had no context, but, I like the sound of this. It's sort of very... You know what I mean? I'm just thinking of it just in isolation.
Well, I was going to say that in terms of the rhythmic drive of it, I don't think it's entirely alien to some of the things that Mozart wrote and enjoyed. And he could, I'm sure, come to appreciate the accentual pattern, even if he wasn't familiar with it.
Right.
But to focus on the harmony again, there is something shocking about that kind of construction. Although, if you want to find logic in it, it does quite follow the sort of spacing of the third or fourth octave of the harmonic series.
And in fact, I was going down that sort of route too. If you look at it also with, I don't want to turn the listeners off at this point, but I mean, if you look at it as a form of extension of a kind of octatonic pitch collection, which it's not entirely because of but effectively the reason why that chord doesn't sound like it's written, and how it's written from memory is it's an E flat 7 on an E major or something. I can't remember.
E, G sharp, B, E flat, G, B flat, D flat, E flat. Yeah.
So, and one of the sort of terrible ways that a very bad, I think, music teacher might say that's bitonal, because there are two triads. If you separate them out, they're two triads that belong in two Tregears. Well, that's forgive the expression BS, in the sense that we don't hear it that way. It's not as if you hear that chord and saying, I'm being pulled in two directions. There's E flat and no.
And also it's not straightforwardly E major and E flat major, because it's basically E major with some upper extensions.
Yeah. But that's still very
as
easy to
constructed.
touch on the octatonic progression,
Yes.
though, because, of course, more accurate, like, that's right, we can think of that as a superimposition also, but even more so would be from Petrushka. The famous C major, F sharp major is pure octatonic minus two notes within the octatonic scale. And I should mention, if that's okay, just quickly, that the octatonic progression, you can hear it. There's the Chopin G minor ballade uses octatonic progression. Beethoven in the last one in the fourth piano concerto, octatonic progression.
Yes, exactly.
It's all I don't know where they consciously knew that they were using this symmetrical scale, but they do use it.
Because and in Ravel is a perfect example of this too, in the way that you can almost hear in a lot of Ravel's music how the octatonic scale, if you like, comes out of an extension of a dominant seventh. It's just simply, and indeed you can hear this back in Schubert too. I mean, I think that the so-called, I'll kick myself. I can think of there's a particular Schubert song that's full of them. But anyway.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, though, unfortunately, it's difficult to think of a sort of comparable situation for us modern-day listeners in terms of thinking of the effects upon Mozart with something like the Rite of Spring. But I'll give this a go. Here's a passage by Harry Partch. Now let me see if I can find it. Here it is, Harry Partch. That was from a piece by Harry Partch, who, of course, contributed a lot of film scores and used a lot of microtones. I wonder if either of my guests here found that alarming in any particular way. Probably not.
Alarming?
Not in the least, right? So it's very difficult to shock the modern-day listener, let alone the deeply considered musician of today. Almost impossible. So I'm trying to find... But nonetheless...
The alarming parts of Harry Partch's style, probably all apart from the microtones, which, to be honest, given his use of them, I don't think many people would necessarily notice if they hadn't been told. But I think the alarming parts of it come from his use of the tropes of Eastern music.
Well, this gets back a little bit into what we were discussing, Peter de Jager, with regard to serialism, with regard to this division or no division between music and noise, right? Because when we're listening to that Harry Partch, well, it's kind of groovy because it's got that rhythmic component, and that's that. And maybe with regard to what Peter Tregear just said earlier, perhaps because of our being conditioned by the machine age, we immediately accept this kind of extremely metronomic format much more. So perhaps that's, in a way, would we agree, that's a sort of decisive factor to some degree when it comes to Mozart, because the whole ways of locomotion, for example, back then and so forth, were just not known in terms of what we now know. Well, with regard to Huxley's "at any given time and place certain thoughts remain unthinkable," what might we think of the tritone, the so-called notorious interval diabolus? Peter Tregear, did people listen to that and shriek in horror?
Often not. And again, it's completely no, of course they didn't in one sense. And of course, this is a perfect example, of course, where one mustn't get too carried away with theory and theoreticians.
Well, they'd have you believe it.
Yeah, because I mean, diabolus in music, of course, I mean, it's not so much that it's a tritone per se. The problem with it is, of course, it represented the failure of the Greek modal system to fit into a nice pattern. It's not. I think it's fair to say it's not the sound of it per se. It's the fact that it just doesn't fit. It's where the mathematics of music, the pattern making music, breaks down. And I mean, this is a pattern. This is a problem we have. You know, that extends again. And it's almost a fundamental human desire we have to see sort of neat, symmetrical patterns of order in the world. This includes in theoretical physics and maths and so on. And so that devil is that. So that when the fact that interval is also in prime common practice tonality both what it is called a pivot of tonal instability, of course, makes it doubly delicious, and therefore it becomes extracted as a sign of what did you say of satanic or of deep instability. I mean, of course, and I love the fact, by the way, that when I talk about that interval with undergraduate students, if you want to see a complete symphony on the augmented fourth, listen to the theme music for The Simpsons.
Right.
Which is very
indeed.
Very Bernstein.
Absolutely.
Yes, quite.
For the entire thing.
Maria.
That's right.
Maria. Exactly right. It becomes that. But otherwise, I think it's not as if that you should be never expected to say, "Oh, that's a augmented fourth. That's the devil in music." It seems a bit.
Well, this is the thing. I wonder how much.
It did seem like, I think there was no formal ban on it in any sense.
No, but to some degree, at least, ostensibly outlawed. I mean, I wonder. This is one of the questions that come up: how much the psychological effect when the powers of church and state deem something to be forbidden, how much that actually affects the hearing. It's very difficult to measure, right? But of the actual listener and how, you know, yeah. What do you think?
It may affect the history of notation. The fact that arguably, you know, at least until the 17th century, we can't be sure that what's written on the page in terms of pitch is actually the pitch is necessary to be sung in most cases, is partly because of this reticence to accept that the world as it is not as pure as the world as we theorise. So it was a delay, I think, in developing. It goes back to what we talked about earlier about, you know, to close the circle of fifths, as you rather beautifully described it. I mean, there's a reluctance to do that. And then, by the way, it brings us straight back to the Liszt and Faust symphonies. You can see why the idea of a free-floating chromatic space is Faustian, because this is the triumph of a kind of going the other way, saying we can't get this sort of Greek modal space to work purely. So what we do is we smash it open and create this kind of ultimately rationalised, free-flowing pitch space of the rationalised formula that creates equal temperament.
Well, ironically, it's irrationalized because, of course, to create pure equal temperament, you're using the geometric mean, which always includes the square root.
The impurities of a well-tempered or the equal temperate scale is precisely, again, if you like, the modern-day devil in music.
What I find so curious about this... Sorry, Peter.
That's what I noticed.
What I find so curious about this is I was just reading some von Helmholtz, right? He was the physicist from the mid-19th century, and he was no slouch, right? He was a very empirically minded and well-researched physicist, and indeed he also researched the effects of certain overtones and sounds in music and acoustic interference and the like. And according to his findings, the tritone didn't register as more dissonant than either the minor or major third, right? In terms of sort of acoustic interference and roughness and so forth, it didn't even register. So what this makes it so curious is how indeed are these sounds registering to us, whether it's back 300 years or right now. It's very difficult to know.
They're registering according to cultural association.
Right.
And that's really it.
It's very hard to extricate that from just the actual sound and how we immediately respond to it, right? It's sort of a
I'm not sure there is anything innate, if you like, though, in that regard. I mean that.
But isn't that bizarre?
There's perhaps some extremely basic level at which we find some sounds more euphonious than others. And on that level, the tritone, because it's very close to a pure 11th harmonic, it would not really register with us, I think, in an isolated context. But because of the cultural associations of it, we really only hear that.
This is fascinating. This is Ragtime. It reminds me of the story of the Polish peasants who are happiest when they sing in a minor mode. This was written by the wonderful critic from the early 20th century, actually right at the beginning of the century, James Huneker. He was talking about Chopin's Etude in C-sharp minor, Opus 10, number 4. And now let's listen to a bit of that, if I can just find it. Incidentally, was the great Vladimir Horowitz from Carnegie Hall in 1947. It happens to be my personal favourite of that piece. People have since played it faster and faster, but he has this controlled fury, which is quite something. So I was quoting Huneker, the critic, James Huneker, remarking about this particular etude, and he said once more, it reminds me of the story of the Polish peasants who are happiest when they sing in a minor mode. Now we're coming to the well-known topic, major happy and minor sad. Who wants to go first? You can pick it up from anywhere you like. How's this struck you over the course of your musical lives?
I'm going to be slightly boring and repetitive here and say that this is again a perfect example where there is a historic truth to this, and that in Western art music culture that there is, in the crudest sense, true. And by the way, another example of the perversity of this was Everard Hanslick talking about the example he uses to say that that music is inherently about music and not, that the way we talk about it is we quickly get into sort of nonsensical observations. He said, which is I've lost my dear Eurydice from that's the English, of course, from None Looks or Clown Eurydice. It's a very famous tune. It's major, and yet he's talking about something absolutely profoundly devastating. And so he makes the point. Well, again, I mean, this would be the reverse of what you're saying about the Polish peasants. Here is when he's most upset, he sings in a beautiful major key. Now, of course, like all these things, the moment you start to pursue them further, you start to see, well, that's not that simple. I think, though, it gets back to what we were talking at the very beginning. I don't think we would rush towards some kind of ultimate truth claim that a major third is definitionally happy. But that's how it's been substantially received in common practice tonality. And it's not as if there is no basis to rationalise that in certain ways. I mean, I think that if you believe in that part of the way that the ear treats dissonance is, that simpler, that the fewer clashes in the harmonic series means that they sound more consonant, then obviously they're in the battle of dissonances, the major third wins over the minor third.
And that's the main argument of Bernstein in there.
Yes, so therefore it sounds more resolved, and indeed there's a whole Renaissance practice called the so-called famous Tiers de Picardy, which would suggest this is true. And so then by definition, in cultural senses, if you refuse to give that final Tiers de Picardy, in a sense, it's a little bit like a Greek tragedy where you're not going to give people.
And that's a great point.
Yeah.
The Tiers de Picardy. I mean, that we as much as we might, as trained musicians can scoff at this notion, so to speak, but really, this is what they practiced. I mean, the notion was that the major is in the affirmative and minor is not. Right? I mean, there's no question, and we know today. So often, I even see on social media these simple videos made about major, smile, happy, and we know what people mean by it, right? So, Peter de Jager, any thoughts on this deep or maybe very superficial subject, whichever one you want?
I don't know that I could answer it better than Peter Tregear just has, but I suppose I do want to go back to acoustic science and say that there are. If you have a length of string, for example, there are two fundamental things you can do with it. You can shorten it in a mathematical ratio, or you can lengthen it in a mathematical ratio. And it's true that only shortening it corresponds to the harmonic series as we can observe as a physical phenomenon, but lengthening it is equally fundamental. And so, in that sense, the major and minor third are sort of conceptually simple mirrors of each other, and yet only the major third is really acoustically real in some sense. So the major third is certainly more resonant, and the minor third is somehow less resonant, and perhaps we usually see it as darker. I think is the metaphor that often gets dropped out.
That was Bernstein in his Harvard lectures was making that point with regards to the overtone series, right? The minor appears at the 18th point.
Well, no, I disagree with this because it's the 19th harmonic certainly is it depends whether you count from 0 or 1, 0 or 1, which is yes, both are possible, but because the 19th harmonic is very, very close to an equal tempered minor third. But I don't think that gives any theoretical weight to the point. I see them as both fundamental in a mathematical sense, but in an acoustic sense, the major third has primacy.
Well, one such musicologist who would have had something to say about this. Anyone who's read much of Derryck Cooke? Oh, yeah. There's a name I just wanted to drag him out for some reason. Any thoughts on because he had very fixed ideas, didn't he, about the harmonic scale and its connotations. Perhaps I would say outdated somewhat, but Peter Tregear, any thoughts on that?
Well, no, it's a long time since I've read. You're quite right. He's massively out of fashion now. So I don't think I can speak with any precision whatsoever.
You'll do better than me.
But I don't think. Again, in the end, I wonder if these are interesting. Quite literally, where we're sitting doing this podcast, a sort of a dinner table sort of conversations. I don't know whether they get us very far ultimately in understanding how music functions in society, beyond the fact of recognising that, as Peter de Jager also said, was that we develop. I mean, with the music, qua music, I said music as just pure sound. The moment it exists in culture, it accrues cultural meanings.
Oh, and I was going to say before that you alluded to an interesting process whereby the theoretical tries to describe the practice and therefore in turn influences the practice in the next...
Which I think is actually brilliant, and of course that's the beauty and the trap of pedagogy of any kind, is that it starts to become not a description but a proscription on the world as we have it, and hence we go back to that thing at the very start about this kind of human nature to push against that and to question it as well, almost culturally, let alone as I think at a kind of epistemological point. There is a reason to do that because, as the devil of music stands to tell us, theory doesn't perfectly describe the world. It just doesn't. So we have to always accept there's more to be found. So for every example of a minor chord for a sad piece, you'll find minor chords in happy pieces. I think the Polish peasants, for instance, one of the things that I remember, I think it was Malcolm Gillies did this in a lecture when I was about 1842, when I was in his class, was that one of the reasons why there's an attraction, particularly in Eastern European folk music, towards the minor scale and the minor modes, is specifically because there's more notes. I mean, there's more, in a kind of melodic sense, you've got more material to play with, and so there's more inflection and more ability to sort of, and I know, and again, all the scare quotes once are put around more and, so on and so forth, but it is true, for any student who's practiced their melodic minor scales, there's simply more notes to play with than you have in a major scale, if we're sticking to the tonal picture. So there's more expressive potential, so they feel, it's a more interesting space. And then you can develop, folk traditions which can sound to us minor key, but are expressing things that are anything but minor.
Yes.
In an emotional sense, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny. It's also hard to extricate this business when I touched upon Derryck Cooke. When I was reading that, I forgot the name of the book. It was written in the mid-20th century, but it's hard to get away from this sense of imperialistic ambition with regard to, England in that case. And also, it sort of parallels a little bit with, I've got this book, The History of the Calculus, which is actually quite interesting, by Charles E. Boyer, but it has the same sense of imperialistic ambitions. And again, I've wanted to circumvent, so far as it's possible, anything to do with politics, but it's difficult not to just touch on the periphery of this, because it comes into play when we're talking about evolution, and certainly with regard to any sense of advancement or progress. And Charles E. Boyer also, when it comes to the history of the calculus, he tends to downgrade the Eastern influence far in great preference for, as I say, the imperialistically minded Western countries. Any thoughts on that, Peter? I know you've delved, both of you, but in your own independent ways, into Eastern traditions anyway with regard to music, so you might have some thoughts here.
Well, because you're talking with regards to mathematics, though.
Well, yeah, that was with regard, but
yes.
paralleling with Derryck Cooke, who clearly has a strong slant, and that's notwithstanding some fine and sensitive observations that he does make.
But yes, I am. I'm currently trying to learn Arabic music, and it's very interesting because one of the perceived differences between Arabic music and Western music from their side is this concept of the major scale, because the major scale is much more of a periphery in their tradition, and in fact the mode which we would associate with the major scale is called ajam, and ajam in Arabic means foreign. So to them that's the foreign sound, and they, much like the Eastern Europeans, and there's very likely some historical link there, I must say, do privilege not only the minor sound but also the in-between, the neutral intervals, which they think is the intrinsic flavour of Arabic music. This that kind of...
That's very curious, because funnily enough, contrary-wise, I was reading the other day about the use of pentatonic scales historically through Chinese history, and that's not to be confused with that the pentatonic scale is emphatically not the Chinese scale, but it is utilized quite a lot. It was, especially as I say, in palaces and temples. Apparently, it had to be utilized in a fairly pure way, and the tones, contrary to what you said, if they were in between, it was considered to encourage a kind of sensuality, which needs to be avoided. It's very, very curious.
Indeed.
Because, and actually the tones in between, to use a Chinese term, is bian or biancheng, meaning to become. So it was this question: if you're not within that scale, for example, you're becoming part of that scale, which sounds almost Nietzschean.
Well, I must point out that those in-between tones in Chinese music can indeed be neutral intervals, i.e. within the context of a pentatonic scale. If you take the large step of a pentatonic scale, then the tone in between, there's no reason not to place it exactly in the middle, because it's a tone which they don't really care about as much tuning correctly, so it's sort of variable. And so one possible and very logical place for it is exactly in the middle. And I'm fairly certain that that's how it developed in Arabic music as well, that they started with a pentatonic basis and then just divided the big interval exactly in two.
That's curious. That's reminding me also of there's a particularly symmetrical scale. One of you will know this, I hope. I've forgotten the name, but one of the Javanese scales, which is divided five
Yes.
tones equidistantly in the scale. You've ventured into that territory, have you?
I just get the sense that for many reasons, one of which I'll mention, Indonesian music and Southeast Asian music is far more complicated than that. But yes, I believe that they do use a system.
Scale, right?
It has been observed a scale that is very nearly equal, like an equalized pentatonic. But the thing is, they're also dealing with percussion instruments, and the basic physics of bars is just
exactly what I was going to say.
is just completely different.
Like tuning bells here. I mean, something the overtone series is weird. It's
Yeah.
like weird in terms of single string. I mean, obviously,
Well, I just want to touch.
No.
This is going. I'm going to open up Pandora's.
But it's
box.
two-dimensional modes of vibration that we have to deal with. Yeah.
I can't resist opening Pandora's box here, though, a little bit. I've heard oft times throughout my life, in fact, more times than I care to mention, how the Western scale, basically, with subdivide equidistant tones as in equal temperament of 12 chromatic tones, is somehow inferior to any number of Eastern scales. Now, I'm not comfortable with that either. I mean, as I was speaking with Peter de Jager a few days ago about, look, there's, we've got the equal temperament, we've got just intonation, we've got mean temperament, we've got the Pythagorean scale. They all treat the chromatic scales differently. And if you superimpose all of those, you're going to get, well, maybe not 36 tones, but some, you're going to get a lot of different sounds, right? Now, maybe, as Peter de Jager was saying, listeners might not be able to readily distinguish between each one. Maybe not, but the point is that the Western culture offers enormous diversity, to use a popular word, in terms of musical expression via so many, I don't want to use the term microtonal, it's a bit in the pejorative, but certainly in between tones. And I don't, what do you think, Peter Tregear? I mean, as I say, I'm just uncomfortable about any culture either downgrading their own or upgrading another with regard to this notion of superiority.
I totally agree. I mean, I think our job as music educators is to open ears, not close them. And I just think that develop fundamental curiosity. That's anything that sort of preempts a sort of foreclosure on open ears, I immediately have a problem with, and that would be mine. I think this is not to say that, of course, and again, it's also to develop the perceptual ability in students to understand that also we don't come to these things neutrally. We come to these things with all the music we've heard as a child and so on, so that even that would also make a judgment call saying that our scale is better or this scale is just, it's just silly. I mean, it's not because I have a problem with value judgment. I certainly don't have a problem with value judgments, and I think I have a problem with people who think there's a problem. But or the idea that at some point we need to talk about, as I was talking about earlier, that there are certain historical and, if you like, conceptual things about Western tradition that means that not that we do things better, but we do things fundamentally different to other cultures. I think that should be able to raise that without also being accused of some form of sort of imperialistic view of culture. So not to be too long-winded about it, but yes, I would also find that deeply uncomfortable and problem. I love that word, academics, problematic.
Good. Let's hear some Bach.
Yeah.
listening to that, I feel I should have left the great Anna Balesman to play the whole movement, but apologies for that, but I'm sure most listeners will know that's the first movement of the first cello suite in G major. Wonderful playing by a cellist who was just an extraordinary musician, actually, had great insight into the musical creativity of Bach, and wrote 2 books I still have called Bach, the Fencing Master. And he was just one of these unique, self-styled scholars, I would say, that is to be valued alongside his truly great artistry in cello playing. Now, this next question, this is slightly comic, but I can't help but ask it. Plato, in his Republic, denounced through Socrates the Ionian and Lydian modes and suggested they were suitable for drinking and encouraged softness of character. Now, it's a funny thing, it did occur to me that if he would look at the whole way things have played out over the course of music, he'd probably say, well, there you go, it proved me right, because he would see nothing but absolute decadence to the most horrifying degree. But in any event, he considered, I believe it was a Dorian and perhaps Phrygian modes that he considered, more able to build one in readiness for war, for example. The Ionian Lydian modes being most unwarlike. And I think even the Mixolydian in another part, not the Republic, but he described it as effeminate or creating those kinds of sentiments. So either of my distinguished guests might like to go first on their thoughts on this and Plato's Republic with regard to music in particular.
I just have to point out that the ancient Greek modes, of course, do not correspond with our modern names derived from the medieval period. I can't remember exactly what they do correspond to, but I know the Phrygian mode, for example, is what they called Phrygian mode, we now call Dorian. That's the one I do remember.
So we just switched them.
They're all wrong.
What about the Ionian?
Basically. Ionian, I don't recall offhand, but I presume it was also the Ionian mode in a Western context was a later addition to the Lydian,
it's hard to know. What about, because they're very closely related, of course.
Again, I'd have to look at my ancient Greek music theory, unfortunately.
Well,
but
that makes it difficult.
It's an unfortunate thing. They probably misunderstood the Greek theorists. I believe they described scales as descending rather than ascending. So anyway, there was a huge misunderstanding there. But your question's really about the association of musical material with different
Sure.
external concepts.
Bach,
which there's
the diatonic harmony in the Ionian mode was just fundamental to the basic, the cosmos as far as he was concerned. And I think he makes a pretty convincing argument in musical terms for it. I don't know, Peter Tregear, anything?
No, look, I think we go back to the way that music accrues cultural meaning. I think that's no more or less than that, isn't it? And I mean, I don't know. This is a field I actually have no direct expertise, but even the names of those modes, if they were still in currency, even if attached to different modes, are attached to different parts of Greece. And there's going to be local political concerns. If you don't particularly like the Ionians or the Dorians or the Phrygians, you're going to associate their music with bad things, and simply because that's a political point. I mean, it's in the way that, say, take a sort of more sort of viscerally uncomfortable thing, that the way that white supremacists in America didn't like jazz because it's associated with African Americans and so on and so on. So I think there's just so many qualifications we have to use that before we can even begin to think of sort of some form of more generalised point you could make about sort of pitch relations and behaviour.
Right.
What I would take from that is, again, what the Greeks are aware of is that music is really a fundamental cultural player in our society, and the thing that I would take away from that is this is why music education matters before we even get into these slightly more esoteric topics. So even if we can fully recognise that there's probably all sorts of prejudice that lie behind a comment like that, the broader point that music matters both to us as individuals, but as society, in the way we think about ourselves and how we define ourselves in the world. I would just reinforce, and of course that's my plug for the fact that everyone should have access as a human right, basically, is basic music education.
Yes.
Indeed.
Great. Well, you're listening to Ragtime. Let's now listen to a little soothing Webern. That little fragment was from Webern's second cantata, Opus 31. I want to do a little thought experiment here. I mean, well, for starters, how did that sound to listeners, familiar or otherwise, with that piece? To me, it has a definite feeling of primal sounds about it, not getting too intellectual and, you know, acknowledging all of the technical craft that's always one of the chief, well, perhaps the chief attribute of Webern. The overall effect has something... well, ancient to say the least about it. Certainly, maybe even pre-harmonic, certainly full of minor ninths and major sevenths and so forth. And as I would like to characterize the word primal with regard to this thought experiment. Now, going back to the supposed origins or genesis of Western music, and I'll stand corrected if I get something wrong here, but more according to Karl Popper, who was no fool, he was a fine scientific and mathematical mind. Well, that was his main vocation. But he also had quite some musical training. And according to him, although I think there are a few little, you know, he was a little bit superficial in his analysis, but more or less it went like this. In 9th, 10th century, well, first of all, he believed that the coming into being of polyphonic harmony was perhaps the greatest discovery, for want of a better word, of Western civilization, not excluding science, period. And he was talking about in the 9th and 10th century organum, where they would practice in the church. It was typically in parallel, moving in parallel octaves, sometimes parallel fifths, and occasionally Farburden, I believe, that would have been with 3rd and 6th, that may have come a little bit later, but typically, if I'm not mistaken, in parallel. Now, according to Popper, it must have happened at one point whereby, say, a singer, unable to continue on their road up in parallel, you know, with the lower voice or something in octaves, may have had to drop down the octave. Someone moving in fifths may have had to drop down a fourth to keep in tune. It may have strained their voice to keep that way. This is a hypothesis. And therefore there was movement of polyphony, albeit somewhat disguised within the otherwise parallel motion. And Popper hypothesized, I think for good reason, that this may have introduced the notion of polyphonic harmony, as in independent or interdependent movement within the harmony itself. Very curious. And also included might be some occasional false notes, which may have made for some rather nice sounds. So it got me thinking, well, let's just substitute this notion of organum in the 9th, 10th century with serialism. Let's just decide that some governing body decided at the outset that all tones should have equal rights, equal potentiality to achieve whatever it is they're after, that one is no, you know, more important or doesn't have primacy over another, and we'll go from there. And there you hear something like this Webern cantata. And then what happens is that some listener notices that within all this there's occasional moments of tonality. There's a little bit of C major there, G major there, and they think, well, that sounds rather nice. It's somewhat incidental. And then they decide, you know what, I can make something out of this. I think I'm going to create something, and they draw things together. They discover the relevance of the overtone series, and they create functional harmony as we know it today. And we can see how that would naturally progress, because then we have let's just somewhat like Renaissance composers with Gesualdo and Lasso and Palestrina and Monteverdi, and then we have Couperin and Rameau and Bach and so forth. And then we would have just this blossoming revolution, I would say. And so I'm just throwing it out there. It's a sort of reversal of what we actually have today. It would strike me that if things had gone that way, hypothetical as a thought experiment though it is, we would have interpreted it as one of the extraordinary triumphs of Western culture. And if so, well, doesn't that mean that we'd have to see this as something of a regression if we've come to serialism from that high point? I know it's a wild. It's drawing a long bow. I just want to throw it as an hypothesis because, incidentally, Ferruccio Busoni wrote, it might have been somewhere between 1906 and 1922, about the idea of young classicism, that it will inevitably have a rebirth, so to speak, out of serialism. And of course, that seems to be true. I mean, we've had minimalism and these movements which reintroduce, do they not, like tonality as we know it. And so there does seem to be something cyclical about it, even if we don't have to...
the flip-flopping again.
Yeah.
I was just going to say that of course, when you listen to a thing like the cantata, and I know Schoenberg was very aware of this, that in fact he was quite troubled by the fact that Webern, his student, was basically outflanking him as the most radical composer. And there's some letters to that effect where he's quite conscious. I don't need to Schoenberg, but I know that was part of it.
Really?
Yeah, he was very conscious of, again, his position in history and was quite concerned about some of the Webern's music was more radical than his. And one of the things that you hear in that is that it with this sort of atomization of pitch. So in Schoenberg you still get pitch collections that are phrased and used in a way that I think you can hear that they are related very much to the tradition that he says. Of course, he made the point that I'm not a huge break of tradition. I'm a continuing of it. With Webern, though, you get the sort of note in itself, the sort of the ding under zip, the sort of the pitch that sort of exists in its own space and time. That I think is where, and I'm not the first to make this observation, but observations have been made, I think, even since the 1950s and 60s, that that's where you get the impetus for things like minimalism, because what they tend to do is they say, we're just going to wallow in, this is back to the Stravinsky and Jager point, the chord or the sound in itself. And we have a completely different perception of what musical time is too. So even though the music might sound very different, there's a conceptual link.
That's very interesting. I mean, Webern himself said something like he feels a piece is finished when it's used up all of the chromatic space. Yeah. Interestingly enough, I don't know, Peter de Jager, any thoughts on... Just, as I say, it doesn't have to relate directly to my question. I just throw that out as to open up a kind of any number of areas of thought.
It opens up many areas of thought, and I mean, mainly my mind is turning over the idea that, you know, the invention or discovery or evolution of polyphony is not a foregone conclusion. Neither is functional harmony. And so I suppose it's just interesting. Well, it's interesting always. I'm always thinking how could music be? What other way of thinking about it? You know, what other framework can we impose upon the raw sound? And I mean, there are just so many. Like I say, I'm exploring Arabic music at the moment, which has a fundamentally different conception. They don't really think of scales, for example. We have melodies which are based around much smaller units of 4 or 5 notes, and you move from one to the other, and they change and mutate in a way that is quite unfamiliar to us. And I mean, that sort of system I find, you know, incredibly pregnant and fascinating, and yet it's completely different, and that might never have occurred in the history of Western music. And so I'd really like to sort of step outside this whole linear evolution, which I think we still take for granted so much.
Well, you're touching on, what about this adoption of, say, Eastern modes by Western composers? It makes me think a bit of that book by Said on Orientalism. It's a polemic work where he believed that this was one of the guiltiest traits of Western culture, that they supposedly adopt Eastern, you know, whether it's, well, I'll talk in musical terms, say, Eastern modes, but then Westernize them, and then from there...
well, indeed.
You know, but I was thinking of a composer like Terry Riley, who I had a good correspondence with. He seems to... he adopted certain Indian scales and so forth, and I think to great effect in his say, Salome Dances for Peace, which
well, absolutely. And I mean, fundamentally, as you point out, within the 12 tones of the Western system, there's an extraordinary amount of flexibility and possibility. And the truth is, so many of those scales, so-called Eastern scales, I mean, are just there inherent in the possible scale structures that we can use. And if we, as long as we don't use them lazily to cheapen a representation of another culture, then we should explore those possibilities freely as well.
Because I mean, and certainly at Said's own thought developed, he certainly wasn't. He would be opposed to the opposition to cultural appropriation, to use the double negative. Right. It's bullshit. Excuse my language, but it's use that word to say that I think I'm going to misquote it. It said that only Jamaicans should only write calypso and the rest of us listen to Beethoven and the two should never mix. That's almost a literal quotation. It's something like that. He said that's a kind of impoverishment. That in fact we should see these cultural artifacts as the inheritance of all of us. What I think he would object to is when sort of Eastern musical tropes are applied to, as you I think Peter was alluding to representations back of the East, which actually tell us more about how the West sees the East than anything, and I'm using Western East in very crude form, of anything that's actually true to them.
Yes.
Which reminds me, can I tell a little anecdote, which is not mine, it's actually a Taruscan one, and it's one that he picked up in a correspondence with, he picked up a letter that a friend of Tchaikovsky had written to Tchaikovsky soon after the Romeo and Juliet overture had been performed. And the letter started basically with the interrogation to Tchaikovsky. He said, "Why did you make Romeo and Juliet Oriental?" You're thinking, there you go. What I love about this is, and by the way, I use this as an example when performers say, what's musicologist got to do with me? What's history got to do with me? Well, this is a perfect example of a musicological observation that I think quite literally changes the way you hear something, right? And Truscan, of course, points out, well, I mean, you know what he's talking about is the great love theme. Da dee da 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 ya da dee da 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 ba da 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 da. It's the da 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 da. I know you're looking at me going, really? Yeah, really. They heard that flattened second that finishes that off as an Oriental signifier, a signifier of the Orient. And in fact, Tchaikovsky didn't deny this. More the point. And then you're thinking, why? And then I often throw this as a student and say, well, okay, just push that a little further. Why would he make Romeo and Juliet linked to an Oriental musical signifier? Which, by the way, I'd never heard it like that. And now when I hear it now, I absolutely hear that that's what a Russian set of ears was hearing, even though it's not, it's not ethnographically Oriental music. Of course it's not. But they heard it that way, and you can start to hear it. Well, I asked you, can you think about why they might?
Well, I certainly Said would be having a lot to say about that, but exactly for that.
Well, and what's one of his tropes about the Western view of the Orient? It's a world of liberated, and ironically, given the tropes we have about the Islamic world now, it's a world of liberated sexuality, particularly with children. And of course, and there's a whole pleasant trope, of course, from French composers and so on, going to Algiers to engage in what we now call modern day pederasty and so on. But I mean, isn't that funny that there it is? And so there's a perfect example, I think, of just again, I love it as an example.
Well, Taruscan's a wonderful provocateur.
Oh, totally.
That was his thing.
Totally. But also, and I think you and I have talked separately about our engagement with him directly. Lots of things I disagree with. I think that's a perfect example of him. He's a brilliant mind, and was a brilliant mind, and one of the greatest. But yes, there's an example I think of what Said's talking about is and I think that's fairly neutral because I think we see Romeo and Juliet as literally heroic figures, but the moment you start to see them depictions through the Western filter of Oriental musical tropes to confirm, in a way, it's a form of the problem that we have now with what they call it, the sort of Stephen Foster Hollow tradition in the US, that it's unfortunately inescapable that what sits behind it is a patronising, infantilising, and view of African American culture.
Sure.
So So it's not the fact that they're borrowing those, pentatonic and other sort of tropes in that case of that culture per se is the problem. It's what it's then used to do is that's the problem.
Right. I mean, it's a curious strain. Like we were touching upon it the other day with Boulez, for example, who clearly believed that with John Cage that this business of bringing into play Eastern influences in his music, Boulez was just not okay with that. And I suppose one can make a distinction between, well, it's a difficult line to draw, but if I bring up, say, this is non-musical, but it relates to what I said with Boulez, Carl Jung, who I think was one of the greatest thinkers of the 20th century, maybe the greatest actually, he just believed that, say, practicing yoga was just, didn't make any sense for a person from the West. It was just not in their, well, let's just use a modern word, DNA, catchword, because it was just of a culture and that the whole heritage that was just not part of their identification or part of their makeup. And I think when Jung says, when I read Jung, I don't feel any racist tinge whatsoever. I think this is just this was a way of, a way of thinking, and still perhaps permeates some thought today. But this false adoption, as a matter of fact, in a way, it rather supports what Said's saying, right, inadvertently or otherwise, that you can't just adopt these practices and make them your own and expect them to preserve authenticity. What do you think? I mean, you yourself are delving into, as you said, Arabic modes and so forth.
Well, yes, indeed. I mean, it's a question, and my my intention ultimately is to learn enough and to, in a sense, bring back some of the concepts into my own creative work. But also, it's something one is constantly thinking about when one's engaging with this music and playing this music. And do
you find, is there a struggle involved in some way, in terms or a deep sense of examination, let's just say?
I really don't know, because personally I tend to, for better or worse, I suppose ignore these kinds of cultural differences, because I just hear this music and I react to it, and I talk to people and I play it, and I sort of immerse myself in that world, which of course is what one should do. And it sort of never crosses my mind to question my, perhaps in the Jungian sense, my suitability or my ultimate ability to, just because I wasn't born in that culture. You know what I mean?
Oh, look, I mean, I think that there has to be room for this. I mean, and depending on one's sensitivity and receptivity in terms of their, musical sensibilities, we can think of Ravel, for example, with the Kaddish. I mean, I don't think Ravel was Jewish. Did he need to be to write one of the most extraordinarily moving works in terms of evoking Jewish sentiment? No, I don't think so. It's just a wonderfully, beautiful work.
Well, no, definitely not. I also would, and perhaps this is something which is not often said and might be sort of more uncomfortable, but I do question quite often. I question quite often a sense of cultural ownership of any tradition.
Sure.
I think history is full of cases where that doesn't end well.
Sure, and that word immerse or immersion is exactly right. I mean, it just depends upon the receptivity of each individual and how much they're able to do that. So, gentlemen, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on board. It's been my great honour and privilege to have you both give your time to this episode of Ragtime, Loose Canon. Thank you, Peter de Jager. Thank you, Peter Tregear. You have been listening to Ragtime.